Good evening, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the American Academy, and very warm thanks to Felix and this wonderful museum. I hope you've had a chance to look through some of the exhibitions, which are economical and actually extremely moving, about Kennedy in general and also about his visit to Berlin, including, by the way, some of the objects, which I've seen for myself for the first time. This is not an atypical event for the American Academy, but it's especially pleasing because it's a great example of how when the world gets larger, it also gets smaller. For me, actually, having Dilip at the Academy this semester is a reunion of old friends, which has been really especially pleasurable. I won't say anything else about him because Claudio Lomnitz will do that, and it's great to see Claudio in Berlin as well. I want to start by thanking the Bosch Foundation for the fellowship that brings Dilip to us. And I promise I won't go on, but with Mr. Henel from the Bosch Foundation, with your permission, I want to tell a story from last year. It's very short. I hope it won't offend you. We do a fellows presentation at the beginning of the semester, and the first person to speak last spring was our Daimler fellow, who thanked everybody but then complained that he hadn't received his car. And the next person to speak was our Bosch fellow, who said, "I don't know what you're complaining about. I have my washing machine." So it's not necessarily part of the deal, but in fact, it was a very nice moment for us. So we thank you for this great collaboration, which keeps us clean in addition to all of the other work. So let me just say a few words about. First of all, I want to mention Berlin Science Week, which is running now for 10 days and is also an important program partner for us, especially for tonight. And then let me say a couple of words about our introducer, Claudio Lomnitz, who is the Campbell Family Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures at Columbia, currently in Berlin on a Humboldt Research Award. Claudio's work focuses on the history, politics, and culture of Latin America, and in particular Mexico. He has published widely on the nation state as a kind of cultural region, on the social work of intellectuals, the historical anthropology of crisis, and the history of exile and ideology in the Mexican Revolution. He is also a well-known contributor to the press and a playwright. So it's great to have you here. We will have a lecture, we will have a question and answer period, and then, again with thanks, a reception, which we hope you will all join us for. So welcome again, and glad to offer you the floor.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much. It's a delight and an honor to introduce our speaker of today, Dilip Gaonkar, who's a professor of communications at Northwestern University and an old friend of mine from 20 years back. We served on the board of a journal, Public Culture, for many years, and I've also been privileged to go to a number of seminars all in various parts of the world that were sponsored by the Center for Transnational Studies that he's directed since 1993. So we go way back, and I just want to say 2 or 3 things about him before we get started on his talk. I'd say that about Dilip, that he's a kind of mercurial figure and a little bit of an éminence grise. It reminded me a little bit when I was thinking about how to introduce him today. For those of you who are soccer fans, of the old sort of legendary middle fielders like Rivellino, this kind of figure who kind of makes the game possible, who's always kind of working the magic of the field from strange and numerous places. Perhaps that's because his field is rhetoric and communication, but he really is someone whose day-to-day praxis involves communication and bringing people and the subjects together. One, I think, telling proof of this aspect of Dilip Gaonkar is the fact that already 20 years ago, a group of people took it upon themselves to publish a book that was devoted to discussing some of his ideas, which I think is a relatively rare thing in the intellectual life, a book that's titled Rhetorical Hermeneutics. Some other, I think, manifestations of this kind of both gregarious but also kind of seminal quality of Dilip Gaonkar is manifest, I think, in some of the roles that he's played. For example, I mentioned that he's directed this curious, odd institution called the Center for Transnational Studies, which is itself kind of transnational and therefore sort of shady. It appears here and there, and all of a sudden there's a conference in Delhi that they've organized, and another one in Chicago, and a third in Ghana, to mention some places that come to mind. Second, he directs a Center for Global Culture and Communication at Northwestern University, which has also, over the years, become a kind of hub for the study of transnationalism, and in particular for the study of the connection between politics and language that one would expect from someone whose training is in rhetoric and in communication. The journal Public Culture, which I mentioned, which he was, I think, really, in some way, maybe the theoretician that was most involved in defining it for a long, long time, at least a good 15 years. And then some editorial projects, of which maybe the best known is Public World series that the University of Minnesota publishes. Again, one of the first editorial ventures to study transnationalism from a cultural point of view in the United States. His training, originally in Mumbai, is in the famous Elphinstone College, if I remember, which produced a kind of bumper crop of major figures in his generation, including Homi Bhabha, Dilip Gaonkar himself, Arjuna Padarai, Akhil Bilgrami. So not a bad cohort. And then he came to the United States, went first to Boston, and then got his PhD in rhetoric at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm going to mention three collective projects that he has that have ended up in publications that I think have been, to a degree, field-defining. One of them is A Globalizing American Studies, which he produced with Brian Edwards, a book that has been really significant in moving American studies into the global field where it obviously belongs. A second, Alternative Modernities, became a kind of almost like a motto, and like those many successful mottos like imagined communities or alternative modernities became so popular that it almost became vacuous. I hope that Dilip abandons it at this point because it has become so big that it's hard to inhabit. And then the third that I think is relevant to the topic of his presentation today is Cultures of Democracy. Again, this attentiveness to the fact that a regime structure like democracy needs to be looked at in some ways, as a communications event, and therefore something that varies significantly historically in time and place. His three main current areas of work are first a set of interventions around something he calls minor figures, a term that comes from Deleuze's work and is about really deterritorialization and intellectual production. This is an area where he and I have also conversed quite a lot since I wrote a book using some of these same ideas on exile and the Mexican Revolution, but his work there has involved interventions with a number of different figures in the 20th century. Then he's got work really on rhetoric, the specificity of rhetoric, which is about rhetoric as an intellectual tradition. And finally, an area of work that he titles Crowds, Riots, and Political Disorder, that is part of what we're going to be hearing about today. So it's a pleasure and an honor to introduce Dilip, and we look forward to hearing what he's got to say. Thank you.
I would like to begin by thanking my friend and colleague Claudio Lomnes for such a generous introduction and reminding me how massively scattered I have been. You know, in a massive way in which I've scattered myself. I would like to thank American Academy for awarding me a Berlin Prize and its president, Michael Steinberg, for being such a magnificent host and an intellectual interlocutor during my stay thus far at the Academy. And he has been my interlocutor for some time with interruptions which are characteristic of academic life. Currently, I hold the Bosch Fellowship in Public Policy at the Academy, and I would like to thank Bosch Foundation and its representative for endowing this fellowship. I would also like to add that at long last, I have actually mastered how the Bosch dryer works. So I would consider that as an achievement. I would like to thank the organizers and sponsors of the Berlin Science Week for including my lecture within this program of offerings. Finally, I would like to thank the Museum of Kennedys, its director Felix Tauf, and its staff for hosting the lecture on their premises. Coming of age in Mumbai in the 1960s, most of my political heroes were what you might call the Bandung figures. Nehru, Nasser, Sukarno, Tito, Nkrumah, Nyerere outside the Bandung circle, people like Lumumba and Che Guevara, that is. Over the years, as I grow old, I've had to revise my estimation of some of those heroes. Against the grain of my political orientation in those days, there were two Western figures whom I greatly admired, who have remained relatively untarnished, JFK and Willy Brandt. This place commemorates, among other things, JFK's historic Berlin visit and his eloquent Ich bin Berliner speech, but also historic meeting of JFK and Brandt and that amazing photograph of them together in the motorcade. You all know there was a third figure in the photo, but with a little bit of help from the Photoshop, I can erase his presence. Thus, I have my own alternative picture to cherish. So that is a good way to start about talking about populism, or at least the specter of populism. Whatever the title of my talk may signal, I'm not here to praise populism, nor am I here to bury it, for it cannot be buried despite the deepest liberal longings. Populism is here to stay. I'll try to explain why such is the case, the persistence and durability of populism, its malleability, its durability, both theoretically and historically, especially at this present socio-historical conjuncture. I'll begin by reading a few pages which quickly summarize the alarm and anxiety resurgence of populism, often referred to as new populism, has triggered among the political theorists, especially among the liberal political theorists based in the United States. After that, I will speak, from out of the notes in conversational manner, and then I'll go back occasionally to reading written text. Here's how the liberals react to new populism. First, it has been called a parasite. It feeds on its host, democracy, especially liberal democracy, the normative default mode of being democratic today. Italian social scientist Nadia Uberati, based in United States at Columbia, has described it as a pathology, a perversion that disfigures liberal democracy, a disease for which there is no cure. This is because it pays no heed to the liberal constitutional values, the rule of law, separation of powers and procedures. It prefers acclamation to deliberation. It is deeply suspicious of representative system that engenders a gap between the elected and the electors, the governors and the governed. It sees this gap as a mechanism that corrupts the ruling elite, the power elite, and makes them indifferent towards the common people and the common good. It wants to bridge this gap with a transformative leader who would embody the will of the people, the real people. It longs for the unity of one people, of the sons and daughters of the soil. Hence, as Jan Werner Müller, a German political theorist, based once again in United States at Princeton, would say rhetoric of populism is moralistic, exclusionary, and anti-pluralist. This is one set of liberal criticism of populism. Second, it has been cast as a shadow by a political theorist by Margaret Canavan that accompanies democracy more ominously as a specter, as a Mexican political theorist Benjamin Arditi says, as a specter it haunts it, or as a pharmacon or a poison drug that both debilitates and cures democracy when it strays from its promise to serve the people in their three constitutive avatars: the sovereign people, the common people, the national people. Political scientist Paul Taggart has described it as a chameleon, adapted taking on the shape and colors of the national cultural context in which it manifests. It is so historically mutable and culturally variable, it is said to have an unresolved Cinderella complex by none other than Isaiah Berlin, a shoe in search of a foot to fit it. It is an empty shell filled with shifting social content, volatile public passions dictated by given political conjuncture. It is a thin-centered ideology with a single core concept, the people, whose referent remains elusive, an empty signifier, according to Claude Laporte. Finally, third group of scholars. It is political, not politics as usual. It is counter-hegemonic and remains anti-institutional even when it partakes in electoral politics and aspires to seize the state. It is politics understood as rhetoric. It is politics imagined in a sensuous performative mode that makes missing people visible, silent people audible. That is Jacques Rancière. It is an unwieldy repertoire of democratic forms, styles, rituals, and practices that to hail and constitute a people defiantly in the face of the paradox of self-authorization, the paradox of constitution making, paradox of the peoplehood as such. It is agonistic. It begins with a demand in the name of the people against the wrong festering in the body politic. It cries out, it howls, but it is not directional. It is not cumulative. It has no grand narrative. It comes and goes and never fully disappears. There is a lot of anger, but there is also a lot of lamentation. Such are the mystifying formulations and characterization of populism, especially the resurgent new populism offered by some of the leading political theorists of our time. So what is going on? Since I am critical of the liberal critique of populism, I want to pose two questions. First, what are the key elements, ideas, proposition, arguments in the liberal critique of populism, some of which I already told you? The second, what is missing in the liberal critique of populism? Before we address those two questions, we have to ask, who are these populists? Or more precisely, who are these new populists? For unlike liberals, socialists, or conservatives, populists both historically and today rarely self-identify themselves as populists. Hence, when a movement is characterized as populist, when the leaders and adherents of such a movement are identified as populists, these designations are bestowed by the outsiders, their political opponents, liberal critics, sociological analysts, and historical interpreters. The most dramatic exception to this naming practice is the People's Party, found in 1891 and dissolved in 1898, also known as the Populist Party in the United States in the last decade of the 19th century. And this was an agrarian, left-wing, reformist party, and not the image of political party we have today. And it had a huge and deep impact on American politics, and it is to a large extent responsible for the progressive era, which many progressive left-wing left politicians hail. So when you think in terms of not only do people of all sorts identify themselves as liberals and conservatives or as Marxists, upon being asked what they stand for, if they are well-read and educated, can invoke a long and distinguished intellectual and textual tradition. There are many people in this audience who think or identify themselves as liberals, some conservatives. If you ask them, what do you stand for, what books you read, what is your intellectual tradition, they will say, liberals will say Locke and Kant and Rawls and Habermas. It's a continuous, rich intellectual and textual tradition. If you ask conservatives, they will say Burke, Coleridge, Matthew Arnold, Santayana, T.S. Eliot. There are books written, such as Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk, who says, conservative mind from Burke to Santayana, then he pushed it to T.S. Eliot. Liberal imagination, you can create books. There are hundreds of books. But there is no such thing as a populist intellectual tradition which people can identify very clearly. This doesn't mean there is no discourses, there are no books, but what you don't have is the equivalent, a Marxist tradition or socialist tradition, and so on. As a result, you can see why intellectuals and scholars for whom populism does not provide material for their trade, because it is intellectually not thick, but rather thin, is not usually something which dwells on. So people constantly ask intellectually inclined people, what is populism? What is the core ideas? Now, the question about new populists, who are the new populists? First of all, if you talk about populism, so the idea of the new populist suggests there were other times, populism was historically present as a movement, as a set of ideological positioning and postures and so on and so forth. So if you look at it in terms of what is the temporal horizon of the new populist, you will quickly realize it has something to do with globalization. That, in fact, with globalization, new populism begins to appear mostly in the advanced Western countries in the United States and Western Europe, and to some extent in Eastern Europe. And the people who are anxious and talk incessantly about populism are usually, if it is in 2016, they will single out two events of great significance. One is the election of Trump. Another is the Brexit. If you get into the 2017, people will begin to point out the latest sighting of populism is the federal election in Germany, where a party got entered into the parliament eventually, and they will, if you get to be even more contemporary, then you will talk about the election in Austria, where once again you have a tendency that so-called populists are coming into political power, right? But if you are not focused only on latest sightings, if you want to expand the temporal frame, and it is possible, especially in Europe, economically advanced and democratically mature countries, anxieties about resurgent populism has been palpable since the beginning of this millennium. There is an extensive scholarly literature on movements mobilized by ultra-right ethno-nationalist groups and parties that pivot on opposing market globalization driven by new technologies, financialization, liberal immigration policies, and these are movements led by, in France, Marie Le Pen and her party. Once upon a time in Holland, it was Pim Fortuyn, and in Austria, it was Haider, and it goes on like that. And now they've got, the people have their successes. List can be expanded to include anti-globalization and anti-austerity protest movements from the left as well. It's not only on the right, also on the left, such as those initiated by Indignados in Spain, which has given rise to a new political party, Podemos, partly led by one of this, I don't want to read that now, and the ruling Syriza party in Greece. So there are also these left-wing political movements which have in fact come to power, as in Greece. And there is Italy's five-star movement started by Beppe Grillo, which is also prospering. So the populist movement on the left and the right have been visible in Europe for almost 20 years. they're somewhat slow in coming in the United States, although, or ignored because the Tea Party was seen as a populist movement, but it took time for it to become far more demanding in terms of attention. So if you think about new populism, you always focus on the European and American experience, and you're talking about advanced liberal democracies, and the puzzle is why in these advanced liberal democracies with so much economic success and prosperity, new populism should take hold. And very often trying to point out to pushing it in the cultural direction of ethnicity, immigration, and so on, it gives a particular reading of the new populism. But if you think about old populism, there were also period in old populism. In fact, in 1967, there was a seminar held at LSE, and a very interesting book was published in 1969 called Populism and Its National Characteristics. There were essays on United States by Hofstadter, and there was also an essay on Russian agrarian populist movement, but the rest was all about the third world, Latin America, Africa, India, and so on and so forth. In that book, also the phrase comes out, populism is a specter that is haunting the world. So populism has had this character of threatening the newly independent countries, new democratic movements, and so on. So in that book, if you read through, unlike the liberal discourse about populism, the central point about that book is that the reason for populist upsurge in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia is the social question. That is, there has been a great deal of economic division between the rich and the poor. The resources of the nation or the region are being distributed in such a way that poor are getting increasingly poor, rich are getting increasingly richer. Although this phenomena is also palpably present in the new populist movement or new populist era, very often when you look at the scholarly liberal analysis about populism, it rarely pays attention to the social question. It very often talks about the ugly rhetoric of populist leaders. It talks about the kind of motivation they have in terms about ethnic cleansing or anti-immigration. Those are the issues which are foregrounded as opposed to economic issues. Not everyone, but that is the impression you get. So as a result, one needs to try to think about the career of populism, not only in terms of its current manifestation in Europe and America, but its historical manifestation in various periods. One is post-decolonization, but prior to that early part of the 19th century, which was not exactly a very important, inspiring period, but also go back into the 19th century. So there are various periods in which populism makes its presence felt, and you have to try to figure out, is there any common feature? Is there any common historical condition that informs these populist movements? Because one of the criticisms over populism by liberals is that populism has no core. It is opportunistic, it manifests itself differently, as they say, as a chameleon in different places in different ways, because very often it's being manipulated by leaders. So as a result, it doesn't have a very clear socio-economic agenda. It may turn out a historical study, if you were to pay attention to history, there is such an underlying thread which runs through the history of populism. It doesn't mean that history of populism, as that thread runs to what I call the thread of social question. It doesn't mean it is not couched very often in a very complicated, sometimes undesirable, sometimes ugly rhetorical expression. So you really have to try to balance about the underlying trends and currents and the public discourse that accompanies it. So let's look at what I want to do is, having tried to historically contextualize the new populism in relation to other forms of populism, I want to try to find out what else is the critique of the liberals against populism. One is, you can probably understand immediately, is that it doesn't really have ideas. It doesn't have normative content. It is ideationally weak. Partly true. But it has one idea. That idea is unassailable. And what is that idea? Even though populism is said to be chameleon-like, rhetorically adapted, adjusting variable sets of socio-historical exigencies, its ideational content can be simply stated in a few interlocking propositions. It's one idea with three interlocking propositions. First, the invocation of the doctrine of sovereignty. The single important idea in populism is the doctrine of popular sovereignty. People are the sole source of political authority and legitimacy in a democracy. The rationale for the existence of any polity, especially one democratically elected, is to serve the people as a whole by promoting common good and collective welfare. It is very difficult to challenge this proposition. Even if you don't live by it, everybody pays lip service to this proposition since the age of revolutions. This is unassailable. The second proposition follows. The current government, this is the discourse of the populist in any given place when they are trying to mobilize people. The current government and the ruling elites have failed over an extended period of time to discharge their duty. Instead, they have subverted democratic system itself, including constitution, to promote their own class interest at the expense of general public interest. Now you have to ask yourself, how often is this true? How often is it true, especially when there is a populist upsurge, populist movement, even if it expresses itself in a not so desirable language and rhetoric? Third, the same group of people, this is true about many, it is time to take the government back from the conniving elites and restore the primacy of the people. Power of the elites, most of the populists concede this. Power of the elites, to the extent it is ineliminable, you can't eliminate elite, should be severely curbed and carefully monitored. The populism is anxious always about the elites. Populism is, the way I've described it, is invariably anti-elite. And you'll see there's a kind of a reversal within liberal political theory. Liberal political theory is always anxious about masses of the people. That is historically and intellectually true. So the populist complaint is thus decidedly anti-elite, even though most of its demagogic leaders come from the elite. Now, this is seen as, once again, a deep weakness of populists. They're being manipulated by rich members of the elite. This has been true, not in the case of, if you consider Trump a populist, and if you think about him as a demagogue, how has he been able to manipulate the kind of a populist upsurge? But this has been true since the Roman Republic, since the Gracchi brothers. All the tribunes of the people who are supposed to control the power of the Senate, which is the power of the elite in Roman Republic, they were almost always from the elite. So this idea that the leaders of populist movements often come from the elites is not in itself something with which you can dismiss populism, or their gullibility and so on. It is one of the phenomena. There are two complementary aspects to this anti-elitism: the generic and the socio-historical. Generically, populists harbor an abiding suspicion that a representative democracy in a complex modern society has inexorable oligarchic tendencies. This is the position of Robert Michels, oligarchic tendencies of democracy. It has generally been accepted as a relatively valid one in terms of organizational structure by people like, distinguished political theorists like Martin Seymour Lipset and all this group of people. It is really not that much challenged about these oligarchic tendencies of democracy. It serves the elite and protects their privileges and property before attending to the needs and demands of the common people. Further, these oligarchic tendencies become acutely and highly visible in the periods of major socio-economic transformations, as in the case today under the long unfolding shadow of capitalist globalization. Predictably, the new populists of every ilk and persuasion stand opposed to the globalization endorsed and promoted by the ruling elite, whether they are from left or they are from the right. They dismiss pro-globalization argument that promises enhanced prosperity via growth, enlarged freedom via mobility and accessibility as self-serving hoax perpetrated by the elites. They don't exactly deny that there has been a massive worldwide growth in productivity and services. There's been wealth created of extraordinary proportion, not only in the United States, but in India and China and so on and so forth. Even, as you know, last week we had a visitor from American Enterprise Institute. As he said, there's almost $40 trillion have been generated in America alone in the last 20 years. But because the dividends from that growth have been distributed so unevenly, whether it is Mexico or India or China or United States or Europe, the populists don't have to resort to their typical, hyperbolic, sometimes ugly rhetoric to make their case against self-aggrandizing elites. Now, this is the tension. This is not only a historical tension, but this is a theoretical tension of democracy, especially of representative democracy. There's a dialectic between the elites and the masses. And this is not new. If you look at the career of a great distinguished classicist, Josh Ober, he has written 2 books. He's written hundreds of books, but he's written, right? He's just amazing, right? One of them is called, in 1989, Mass and Elite in Democratic Athens, Rhetoric, Ideology, and the Power of the People, where he basically tries to show how the Athenian democracy continuously had to contend this tension between the power of the elites and of the masses, although masses had no choice but always to be ruled by the elite. This is one of the things also, the idea that masses want to take over is really a historically not true claim. That the idea they want to seize the property and they actually have long historically shown that they are being ready to be ruled by the elite, but under certain conditions. The second book, which is about 10 years later, he says, Political Dissent in Democratic Athens. Political dissent in democratic Athens, you will immediately say, must be from the lower classes. No. He's talking about intellectual critiques of popular rule. Who does it include? Thucydides, Plato, Xenophon, Aristophanes. So basically, what he's trying to say is there's been an intellectual tradition in Athens where the intellectuals have always been anxious about the rule of the masses, rule of the popular rule. Popular rule has been an object of intellectual critique and anxiety. Now, it's not just Josh Ober and the Athenians. If you look at Federalist Papers 63, Madison, Alexander Madison says, one of the greatest achievements of American Constitution is we have fully, completely neutralized the people as collective agents. We can leave them as individual agent, but collective agent we have been able to neutralize them. Virtue is, this is why people like, if you go from Madison to Glenn Beck, that's not a good way to talk about Glenn Beck, I know, but Glenn Beck always says, America is not a democracy, it is a republic. It is a Lincoln who Gary Will says, who made it into a democracy by saying government of the people, by the people, for the people. The whole idea was to discipline, bridle the people. And the way to discipline and bridle the people is through constitution. This goes all the way back to Aristotle. We need balanced government and so on. So there has been all the massive intellectual energy has gone into liberal, Republican energy has gone into bridling the people, controlling the people. Where is the discourse? Where is the political theory? Where is the thing about bridling, controlling, disciplining the elites? Where is the intellectual tradition which can come from Aristophanes and Thucydides to Madison and Glenn Beck? So this is a question one needs to intellectually address. So there are people, it's not like there's absolutely zero, my thing about it. There are people who said there is a way to control the power of the elites. One of them is Robert Dahl, who basically said the health of the democracy is predicated on intra-elite rivalry. Intra-elite rivalry. So elites will compete with each other in order to win the consent and the support of the people. As a result, intra-elite rivalry makes sure there is not too much power. As Acton says, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. The preventing it is by intra-elite rivalry. That is Robert Dahl's theory of why pluralistic, or what he calls polyarchy, pluralist democracy is possible in the United States. And he was quarreling with his colleague at Columbia, C. Wright Mills, who had just written a book called Power Elites, in which he had said that in America, the elites, instead of competing with each other, are beginning to converge. The university elite, military elite, financial elite, political elites, and so on. So, if you think about curbing and bridling the elite, you need a theory of the competition between them, and you need a historical conditions of divergence of their interest and their orientation, their values and norms. So you have to look at United States today and in other parts of the world with globalization. Is there a convergence or divergence of elite formations? Despite all the noise, ideological kind of a noise between Fox News versus MSNBC and so on and so forth, one can make a very strong case the people or the masses are more agitated today because there is an extraordinary convergence of interest, values, lifestyle, and so on of the elites, from the university to military to plutocracy to political elites and so on. There's a far more operating consensus, what they used to call Washington consensus. There is a much bigger consensus than a Washington consensus. So we are in a historical formation where there's a kind of a convergence of elite power which is making the masses consciously or subconsciously. You don't need a theorist. There's such a thing called the political unconscious, which is making them restless. And that's what you see in terms of. So this structural tension between the masses and elites are never going to go away. So in a way, question arises is what is the way? And I don't think there's ever a question about mass rule. Despite the popular rule and all, elites will always rule. The question is, how does elite take responsibility to govern itself? And people like Galbraith, who basically said the solution is what he called the countervailing power. He didn't want to break up big corporations and so on. Instead, he wanted to create various sources of power which will countervail each other, including state being an important player. So there are ideas floating around, but compared to the ideas that are floating, the amount of intellectual energy that has been spent on theorizing how to bridle, control, domesticate the people or the masses, there's pitifully little about how to sort of direct the elite to become responsible in a certain way and to create a world in which the relation is not predatory vis-a-vis the masses. So that is, so how much time do I have left? 5 minutes, right? No, I'm always running out of. So let me talk about this, that ideational one. You know, I'm not going to go into the social question. I wanted to talk considerably about social question. Either you agree with it or you don't agree with it, because social question is really the widening, what do you call, widening disparity of economic disparity that is unfolding all over the world. But let me put it slightly differently, because when we think about Europe and America, when you talk about social inequality, or as I was growing up in 1960, or when people like, you know, Gellner and Ionesco wrote that book about populism in 1960s, poverty was a looming phenomena in the third world. There wasn't that much poverty in Europe and America, but there was still a different kind of socio-economic situation. Today, one of the things one has to admit, not only about Europe, especially Europe and the United States, that we live in affluent societies. So the question is, what is the status? What is the issue? It is not an issue about poverty in a subsistence wages or something like that. It is a question about what is a reasonably decent, dignified human life for average people. In a way, the quest is for that decent, dignified life for people in Europe and America, and also rest of the world. So what kind of division of resources, what kind of an equitable principle that is required in order to have a decent and dignified life for common people. Now, populist complaint has remained remarkably unchanged despite its various historical manifestations. To begin with, the social question, while rooted in the growing economic inequality, has additional cultural, political, and affective manifestations. Declining income has been compounded by deeply felt status anxiety, especially among white men, I'm talking about the United States, which is often accompanied by racist, ethno-national, patriarchal, heteronormative rhetoric. Finally, there's a pervasive sense of powerlessness, the loss of political agency and citizen agency for many living in complex Western societies dominated by high finance. They don't know how it happens. You know, I mean, they're talking about, I mean, 2 days ago there was an article about how with this huge wealth that has been created in the stock market in the last 5 years, the retail investor, even of the middle class, are sitting out because they've been traumatized by 2008. Whereas the institutional investors and those people whose money is with the institutional investor are making huge amount of money. So you can see that is, most people are not ready to, don't have the resources living in a complex Western-dominated society, high finance, power technology, and expert knowledge. Anger and resentment are palpable. They are directed not only at the minorities and immigrants who are allegedly cutting the line, stealing the jobs, but also at ruling elites with their cosmopolitan tastes, technocratic mindset, and who seem indifferent to the plight of the, to borrow Paul Taggart's one, people of the heartland. So let me conclude with a few statements, because I'm not going to talk about, I have much more to say about social question, which I won't. Okay, let me read a page and a half, which I'll rush through. Populism and social question, which I didn't really discuss because, you know, I said social question has not been dealt with, but in a way it's also been dealt with since the publication of somebody like Piketty's book on capital in the 20th century and so on. There's a lot of discussion about it, but it's not discussion in relation to populism, especially the liberal critique of populism, which dominates the public discourse. Piketty's book is seen as a very arcane kind of intellectual endeavor. Populism and social questions have parallel careers since the near universal acceptance of doctrine of popular sovereignty in the aftermath of the Great Revolution in the late 18th century. Populist movements, whether as embryonic eruptions or as full-fledged political campaigns, rarely materialize, this is my historical claim, rarely materialize in the absence of serious socio-economic upheaval, resulting in unmistakable duress for a sizable portion of the people. Lawrence Goodwin, masterful history of the agrarian revolt in the United States during the 1980s and 1920s, a magnificent book called Populist Movement, unequivocally establishes a causal link which has been reiterated in many historical and sociological studies of populism of the past. And political theorists of the liberal ilk ignore this entire literature, historical and sociological literature. What constitutes a state of socio-economic duress might vary significantly across time and place, especially in an affluent society like ours, especially in contemporary affluent societies, which have witnessed to resurgence of populism in their midst. Political thought cannot contribute much to our understanding of new populism if it remains content to simply disclose and deconstruct what we already know about populism. Its ideational thinness, only one idea, its normative emptiness, its recourse to ugly rhetoric, and variability of its social content. Political thought instead give an account of the structural tension inherent in the representative democracy, the inescapable tension between the elites and the masses, not simply in terms of disciplining the volatility of the latter with constitutional mechanisms, as proposed by James Madison, but in curbing the relentless encroachment of the former, what was once deemed common, an encroachment permitted by law. I'm talking about the elites. An encroachment, very often, see, when we talk about the billionaires of the robber baron era, there was some illegal kind of a thing. When you talk about the people today, they are almost all within the legal parameters, facilitated by governmentality, encouraged by market. In an age when elites are inured themselves to critique, often under the alibi of meritocracy, we are in urgent need of a theory of elite formation and their formidable powers. In conclusion, let me say that populism is always related to socioeconomic condition, not just economic inequalities, but also connected with disruptions of social stratification, which breed a certain form of enemy, not sort of enemy that leads to suicide, as described by Durkheim, but to disoriented rage. There is no such thing as managed social change at the macro level. It is always disruptive and tumultuous, like one we are all passing through today. Such changes are always wrought on the back of the common people and the laboring classes, as masterfully demonstrated by Karl Polanyi in Great Transformation. Sooner or later they erupt, but always a bit late, well after the changes have reached the point of irreversibility. As with globalization, robotics, and on-demand economy today, the populist dragon, like Minerva's owl, rises only when the dusk has fallen. Unlike the owl, the dragon does not fly gently into the twilight. It spews fire in an exhausting death dance. Thus, once again, the poor and not so poor, the children of lesser God, remain unredeemed, and the day of reckoning for the elites and the super elites is deferred. But for how long? Thank you.
So how would you consider as this phenomenon AFD? And the Germans, of course, I think, remembering the past, they are extremely afraid of such a movement. Because if you refer to the past, it was a populist movement as well.
I didn't have
again a populist movement.
Yeah, I didn't have the time to elaborate on. I said populism has has one single idea about people. It's always in the name of the people. As AFD also is in the name of the people, as Trump says, make America great again. And who does he or AFD has in mind? So there are three concepts of the people which are competing in very interesting ways, which I don't have the time to elaborate. Those are the idea of the people as the sovereign people, which is a very statist idea. And the idea of sovereignty itself is now in trouble. The other one is the idea of the people as national people. And the third one is the idea of the people as common people. Idea of the people as the national people is the one at the center of the present present crisis. It is on one hand is from the pressure of so-called European Union, other from the pressure from the idea of the what you call immigration and refugee kind of issues. So what can one say about the idea of the national people? Now, people have talked about nationalism has a dark side and the bright side. This has been the history of the discourse on nationalism. So it appears sometimes the idea of the national people can be used to exclude people. But before we jump to the conclusion, that's what's happening, democracy itself has an element of exclusion. When we talk about citizenship, there's an exclusionary rhetoric to democracy in terms of who's a citizen, who's not a citizen. And if you think about, once again, going back to Josh Ober, the Athenian experience, the more deeper the citizenship rights became in Athens, more exclusionary they became. The moment Athenians began to pay for you to go to the meeting, to the agora, they also made it that only Athenian citizenship will be bequeathed to people whose both parents were Athenian. So there's this whole dialectic about exclusion within democracy, the national priority, which is very often deflected by the so-called cosmopolitanism. So the question basically is, how does one want to talk about nationalism and cosmopolitanism? In a way, Europe, which has prides itself for a long period of time having introduced the idea of cosmopolitanism, is now being forced to re-examine its presuppositions. I mean, this is the ideological way in which it has shaped itself. So AFD and all, this is not only, you see, this is the version which you have in Europe. This is the kind of a version you have in India. You have it in South Africa. Always, you see, it's not only in Germany, refugees are pouring in. There are different kind of refugees. The Bangladeshis are constantly going into India, although India is not exactly a very rich country. Zimbabweans are always going into South Africa. So they have all the same issues. And there is populist movement which goes on, which is a question about the privilege of citizenship. So we have not worked it out.
Thank you for your lecture. How do you differ between right and left populism, or do you think it's all the same?
Say that again.
How do you differ between right and left populism, or do you think it's all the same?
Well, it is not very clear. Their arguments very often are similar, but it is basically what kind of a socio-historical pressure which is operating at a given point in time. So the right populism very often arises from a certain kind of socio-economic background, and the left populism works on a different socio-economic section. One could argue, more affluent the society, there's a possibility of greater right populism rather than left populism. So the kind of a left you see, you also have to ask yourself, what would be the current phase of left populism other than in Spain and in Greece and a couple of other countries? The kind of a left populism you would have expected in Asia, they are far more weak today than you would imagine. You would expect there would be a lot of left populism happening. The question to ask is, instead of theoretically trying to distinguish between the left and the right populism, one has to ask, why is such an upsurge of right populism in advanced European countries and in the United States, whereas the left populism is not really that dominant, So I think it is a socio-historical question. It is a lot to do with globalization. It's in a way a fraying of the idea of the privileged membership of a nation. There was so much privilege went with becoming American, especially white American. And those are being now, you see, this is not even a question about whether it is empirically correct. The question is how it is perceived. And the perception is the privileges associated with the membership of a particular political community, one which was really privileged, are now being drained by the elite, who are far more global in their orientation. That seems to be the big argument of the Tea Party. I mean, you think about somebody like Steve Bannon, when he talks about economic nationalism, he's really talking about, in some way, he thinks, you can do a critique of the idea of economic nationalism. It's not going to go anywhere because of the way he developed it. But the rhetorical force is basically the economic nationalism which he's proposing will, in a way, uplift the economic plight of the American working class. I think
Christian Hähnel, I represent the foundation that uses the profits of the daughter company selling washing machines and other goods for our nonprofit projects. How, Professor? Well, thank you very much first for your very thought-provoking lecture. I was never able to build a bridge between Madison and Glenn Beck. Now I am. I don't know whether that's a good thing, but very thought-provoking. How can a foundation, and I think the Bosch Foundation is far from unique in this respect, that carries multilateralism and a belief in globalization being a fact in its mission statement, as well as that it's praising itself as promoting inclusive dialogues, how can such a foundation engage in a dialogue with those who follow the populist that mirror the image of the national people? Are there platforms, formats that come to your mind where such a dialogue would be possible?
Well, I think such a dialogue is happening. I mean, sort of, there are people who are trying to stifle the dialogue. There's a lot of foundation, NGOs, national NGOs, global NGOs are doing. I mean, also, you see, this is the thing. When you think in terms of the wealth that is being created, it is also being used by people like Bill Gates and so on to create all sorts of, programs, public health. Also, one has to also think about how the quality of life has improved in many places. I was just trying to talk about, in terms of public health, and I mean, whether Bosch Foundation is into public health or not, but, like Gates kind of public health, you think about both state-sponsored and other one, public health has created life expectancy so much greater. I have one very, very popular example, and today I was sort of going through that. Queen Anne, who lived 51 years, she was pregnant 17 times. Only 5 were born. And they lived 1 2 minutes, 1 2 hours, one for 1 year, another for 2 years, and the only child who lived to 11. That is, a queen's 17 pregnancies, she is only 5 children, and none of them lived past 11, right? When you think about the worst ghetto, worst slum in India, a woman who were to get pregnant 17 times, most of them will live to be 50 in India because of public health and things like that. There's a lot of things that has been done in terms of public health and all. But what is not clear is whether we are providing enough resources to people, ultimately economic resources to people, who are all above subsistence level, like China and India, especially China, which has put so many people on $2 a day and now moving and things like that. What constitutes a dignified life, not only to live, but live with dignity and enjoy kind of thing? Those things, I don't know how a foundation, for instance, which can remove the negative effects, for instance, through education and through public health, by removing violent kind of a situation and all. This redistribution, the idea about how to redistribute the wealth, which is massively created, not equitable redistribution. Nobody has an idea other than universal minimum, guaranteed minimum income. That's what's being proposed. But people don't have, and there are too many skeptics, So, in fact, and famous philosopher's theory, Rawls's second principle of redistribution, people write endless number of books, but hasn't been put into use. So the question is redistribution, which is relatively effective. And and people say if you give them minimum income, they are all going to get lazy. They're not going to work. They talk about opioid crisis and so on and so forth. I don't believe in that, but the point is no one really has a very compelling strategy, institutional strategy for redistribution of wealth, including the rich people who say there are many rich people who say I should be taxed more and so on. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Could you make the argument that one of the possibly one of the reasons why the populism as it currently exists in Europe has taken hold in Europe, and we need the mic, do I? Oh, the video. Oh, okay, sure. Is that the colonial relationship that defined subjectivity in the third world, 19th century, 18th century, 17th, has come home to Europe, finally, in a certain sense. And so that European subjects find themselves experiencing the colonial relationship. And so that the ways in which populism operated, for example, in decolonial movements is in a certain sense not the same, but has echoes. It's the same historical situation where there's a huge gap between rich and poor. In that case, historically, it was the colonial master and the colonized subject. Here, it's the Brussels elite or the corporate elite and the quote common man. So I'm just wondering, is it possible to think about
internal colonialism?
Yeah, that it's sort of.
I mean,
repressed in a certain sense.
There have been books about like Irish as being internally colonized as opposed to Indians being externally colonized by the British and so on. But the colonial metaphor will not work largely because especially within country like United States and all, not that there isn't this incredible, first of all, there is a black experience which is distinctly a kind of a extraction of wealth out of the labor of the slave population and later on underpaying and so on and so forth. There is a kind of extraction. But I don't think the idea of driving a large segment of people towards subsistence wages is the strategy of contemporary capitalism. There was at various periods of time. Today, I think capitalism is undergoing such radical transformations. I do believe when people talk about whether they are liberals or conservatives who talk about we need to create jobs. We can create jobs. This has been going on since Bill Clinton. He said we are going to create jobs. Jobs are going other countries, but we're going to create jobs, better jobs, higher paying jobs, rather that the less paying jobs, hard jobs will go to Asia. But within 2 years, the most complex jobs were going to Asia. And today, you see, this is the problematic about, it's not a question about outsourcing only, but I'll come back to that. IBM, when I was a kid, IBM was kicked out of India, and nobody knows about that because IBM's particular practices. And today, IBM has more people working in India than in the United States. But that is the kind of outsourcing kind of a drama people create. But then again, something like Infosys in India, a company, is employing thousands of people in the United States. They are no longer simply, doing all the job in the United States. Many of the third world companies, which were supposed to be the ones who are skimming away the jobs, stealing the jobs, are actually creating jobs in United States. And if you see, you have this staggering experience when you land in London and you take the, Heathrow Express, sponsored by Tata Communications, right? And Tata Communications for a while was the biggest private employer in England. So there are all kind of paradoxes. But the point is, I do believe when most of the politicians say we want to create jobs, but I don't know whether they can create jobs because robotics is on the corner, okay? And then there is the so-called on-demand economy is all over the place. So the kind of rethinking that is required today is a very different sort. You can't say, okay, the market will do the job itself. But I think it's a very complex economic, because capitalism is not one, it's undergoing dramatic changes, and I don't think there's an alternative to capitalism either of some kind. But the question basically is, when capitalism is functioning dysfunctionally, especially at the moment of its incredible growth, you have populism. Populism is an aberrant response to the way the capitalism is unfolding today.
Sometimes it's said that the rise of populism in the United
I think
States.
it's yours.
Sorry. Sometimes my name is Jacqueline Ross. Sometimes it's said that the rise of populism in the U.S. has to do with the relative weakness of the social welfare network in the United States. On the other hand, you have populism rising in Europe, where you have much more of a social welfare network. Same with unions. Sometimes it's said it has to do with the weakness of unions in the United States, but you have somewhat stronger unions in Europe, and yet you have populism on the rise in Europe as well. Does this indicate that you have different forms of populism, different things going on in the United States and in Europe, or does it indicate that it's a common phenomenon that's unrelated to the strength of the social welfare network in either place?
I don't think there is an objective measure of what level of social welfare and network is sufficient to keep people happy. You know, it may be the case United States has less than in Germany, say, but I remember the person who came to give a lecture, who introduced Nancy, who basically said there are a lot of people in Germany who feel, although social welfare system is very generous in some way compared to United States, it is not generous enough, and many of the resources are being directed at other people who should not have the priority over them. That kind of argument is still very much in play. So I really don't know the details about how the social welfare is being distributed, you know. But the point is, there are so many political programs have sought to marketize all of these things. I don't know what the state in Europe is, but in America they've been trying to put it into a market principle, healthcare, social security, and that which they are hoping to do. But this is the point about whether market principle can solve this. And then you have the looming example of China, which seems to be, in a way, a different mode of governance, not that it's completely out of market. And so, you know, Berggruen Foundation, you know, one of your competing foundation, which is basically talking about China model. That China model will tell us about how to actually manage capitalism with better, not equitable, at least better distribution, and as a result they will have less populist kind of uprising, which is not true, because Social Science Foundation of China itself records what they call people's mass movement. That is mass incident, that's the term, people's mass incident. There are something like 150,000 people's mass incidents in China, but in the countryside. So it is not all rosy in China as people do, but there are people who basically think what we need is a kind of a patriarchal, not patriarchal, paternalistic kind of a social management rather than democracy. So there is democracy is being criticized when people talk about China model. So if you want to keep democracy in its tension between the elite and the masses, and if you need to keep capitalism as the only viable economic mode of organizing, you know, large part of the market, large part of economic life, you need new ideas. I don't have those ideas, but I think we need new ideas. But you know, you think in terms of, especially distribution of income is absolutely impossible, because a few days ago I read this article by James C. Scott, who's one of my heroes, because he's sort of been always talking about people's attempt to resist being incorporated into a kind of a, you know, a managed society. And he's comparing two people. One is Piketty. He says, if you want to follow Piketty, ultimately you have to tax the rich people and wealth 80%. He says, James Scott himself says, that's no starter. It's not going to happen, period, right? And then he is reviewing a book by Walter Scheidel, who's written a book called Great Leveler. And his argument, you know, from Stone Ages to the present, you know, very huge historic sweep. He says the only time inequality declines is in times of great big revolutions and during catastrophic wars. Basically, inequality is reduced by massive pillage, destruction of property, and hundreds and thousands of people die. He says, is that worth it? That's the only time. And then after these kind of a great revolutions and great catastrophes, the inequality index once again rises up very quickly. So in a way, how to deal with the problem of inequality is I think there's been a tension in Western intellectual thought between libertarian thought about how to enhance people's freedom. Apple, Google, all of them say, we are libertarian companies. We are going to make you free. And they do make you free. And they also say that they are egalitarian companies. Everybody has access to them, right? But that egalitarianism stops at making everything accessible to everybody. But the question about egalitarian principle, how to create equality, unlike deepening liberty, increasing freedom of people, of color, people of sexual preference, people, women and so on. This has been happening in a particular way. There have been reversals. But the idea about creating an equal society, it doesn't have a grand narrative. It doesn't have a trajectory. It is like a spread, a volatile spread, goes back and forth. And so as a result, the question of equality, when you think in terms of a deep thought about equality, there's very little about equality. Equality very often turns into a discussion of equality by the liberals, invariably turn into lexical priority of equal liberty for all. You see, it always turned into a libertarian principle. And then the question of solidarity, which is what Europe is facing. Can we have a cosmopolitan solidarity of the world? Can we have a cosmopolitan solidarity of Europe or India or certain parts of Arab world and things like that, as opposed to a solidarity grounded in nation state, which itself is based on a very complex history of cleansing. So when you think in terms of a theory of solidarity, like Habermas's idea, the constitutional patriotism, the solidarity will come out of commitment to a set of laws. It's a kind of a libertarian idea, even though he's very much a social thinker. Much more egalitarian aspirations, because when you think in terms of the Constitution itself is an object of critique by the populists. They do it in a very bad way, but you have to take about Constitution. In a country like India, there's a lot more social struggle. See, I don't want to represent eventually India. You see, I have a notion called there are three types of democracy: good, bad, and the ugly. India is an ugly democracy, but it functions better than most other democracies because there are more countervailing sources of power. Modi is nowhere as powerful as many other, Erdogan and things like that, because he's hobbled by the federal system. It's very corrupt and all of those things, but he will not have the kind of a power Erdogan has or Sisi has, or you are afraid that Trump might have. It is not because Americans are putting all their faith into the Supreme Court and the Constitution, whereas the Indians are putting their faith in multiple centers of power, whether it is a state party or multiple parties, people getting on the street, and so on and so forth. So in some way, we have to create ways of decentering power and also redistributing wealth. But neither of them is a very easy thing. Decentering power might be more organic to a culture, but, well, I don't think I'm giving you a very optimistic view of the world. Thank you.